It's the winter of 1878, deep in the frozen mountains of Utah. A traveling merchant rides into a quiet little valley, carrying a leather satchel that, unknown to him, contains the kind of secret that could shatter an entire community. This isn't a ghost story. It isn't about demons or curses. What he discovered was something far worse. A family whose evil wasn't supernatural at all, but born in their very blood. This is the Fairmont secret, and tonight you'll hear part 1 of their story. The Quiet Valley, Cedar Valley, Utah, in 1878 was a small but thriving frontier town. Only about 400 people lived there, tucked between red cliffs and wide stretches of desert sage. Most of the families were Mormon pioneers who had come west in the 1850s, hoping for religious freedom and a better life. The town was simple: wooden homes, farmland, a church at the center. But one family stood above everyone else. Literally, high on a rise overlooking the valley was the Fairmont estate, 3,000 acres of fertile land, rows of fruit trees, and a mansion built of sandstone that looked more like a European manor than anything you'd expect in the American wilderness. The Fairmonts were wealthy, powerful, and untouchable. The Fairmont family. At the head of the family was Augustus Fairmont, a man in his 60s with silver hair, fine suits, and the manners of an English noble. He claimed his family descended from Yorkshire nobility, and he had the documents, the crests, and the imported furniture to prove it. His wife, Eleanor, was known for her beauty, elegance, and charity work. To outsiders, she was the perfect frontier lady. They had 3 grown children: Theodore, the oldest son, who ran the ranch; Marcus, the clever negotiator, who made their business contracts; Isabel, their daughter, celebrated as one of the most beautiful women in the Utah Territory. Even the grandchildren seemed remarkable. Augustus Jr. and Victoria, teenage twins, were already natural leaders among their peers. Marcus's son Edgar was just as sharp. The community saw them as the ideal pioneer family. The Fairmonts didn't just have money. They had influence. Every land dispute, every business deal, every community decision, somehow, the Fairmonts always came out on top. And if a rival farmer had a sudden crop failure, or a neighbor died unexpectedly, people just shrugged and said, "That's frontier life." No one dared suggest the Fairmonts had anything to do with it. Enter Jacob Hensworth. On a freezing February morning in 1878, a stranger arrived in Cedar Valley. His name was Jacob Hensworth, a traveling merchant and genealogical researcher from Philadelphia. He carried a heavy leather satchel filled with birth records, marriage certificates, and family trees. At first, people thought he was just passing through. But Jacob had a very specific reason for coming. He'd been hired to investigate a legal dispute over a huge estate back east. And one of the claimants to that fortune was none other than Augustus Fairmont of Cedar Valley, Utah. First impressions. Jacob's first view of the Fairmont estate left him stunned. Against the rough wooden cabins of the valley, the mansion looked like it belonged in London or Paris. Rows of fruit trees lined the property, white fences gleamed in the winter light, and the sandstone house stood tall and proud. When Jacob met Augustus in his private study, he was greeted with fine brandy, warm hospitality, and a leather portfolio of authentic Fairmont family records. At first glance, the documents seemed legitimate. But Jacob had a trained eye. He noticed that the paper looked too new for its supposed age. Some official seals were misspelled. And strangest of all, the handwriting on documents from different centuries looked suspiciously the same. When Jacob cautiously brought up his concerns, Augustus's smile never faded. But his eyes turned cold. "Mr. Hensworth," he said softly, "sometimes history requires creative preservation. A man of your intelligence surely understands that the spirit of truth can matter more than the details of paperwork." It wasn't a correction. It was a warning. Dinner with the Fairmonts. That night, Jacob was invited to dinner with the entire Fairmont family. The table was set with fine china and crystal glasses, luxuries almost unheard of in the West. The food was excellent, the conversation was polite, but beneath the smiles and manners, Jacob sensed something deeply unsettling. The family's words were careful, their glances sharp, as if they were speaking in codes only they understood. When they discussed neighbors who had suffered tragedies, failed farms, sudden deaths, they spoke with a cold detachment, almost as if these misfortunes had been expected. What disturbed Jacob most were the teenagers. Augustus Jr. and Victoria, only 17, spoke with eerie sophistication. They watched everything closely, like predators studying their prey. At one point, when Eleanor mentioned a neighbor who had died suddenly, Victoria said, with an icy smile, "How unfortunate that Mr. Caldwell proved inadequate for frontier life." Jacob later wrote in his journal, "Greater than, it was the way she said it. As if his death was not sad, but inevitable. As if weakness deserved punishment. .. The threat. After dinner, Augustus invited Jacob back to his study. Behind closed doors, the mask slipped further. Augustus spoke of natural selection, of how only the strongest families survived on the frontier. He hinted at how rivals who crossed the Fairmonts always seemed to meet with accidents or illnesses. Then he leaned in close and said, "I hope you'll find our family records satisfactory. It would be most unfortunate if technical irregularities were to overshadow the essential truth of our heritage." It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. The search. When Jacob returned to his room at the local boarding house, his heart sank. His satchel had been searched. The window latch was broken. His papers had been disturbed, though nothing was missing. The next morning, the boarding house owner brought him a message. His elderly mother in Philadelphia was gravely ill and calling for him. The message had been delivered by a Fairmont ranch hand. Jacob knew immediately, it was a lie. His mother was in perfect health. The Fairmonts were trying to scare him out of town before he could dig any deeper. But instead of leaving, Jacob decided to play along. He announced his departure, but secretly began his most dangerous investigation yet. Pushpin to audience. And that's where we'll leave part 1 of the Fairmont secret. A wealthy frontier family. Forged documents. A stranger who knows too much. But what Jacob would uncover next went far beyond paperwork. It would expose a legacy of cruelty stretching back generations. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss part 2, where Jacob uncovers the first real evidence of what the Fairmonts were hiding. The Fairmont Secret, Part 2, The Records That Shouldn't Exist. Studio microphone, hook. When Jacob Hensworth received the fake message that his mother was gravely ill back in Philadelphia, he felt two things at once, fear and suspicion. He knew the Fairmonts had sent that message. He also knew if he confronted them, it could be the last mistake he ever made. So instead of racing home, he quietly left Cedar Valley. But he didn't head east. He rode straight to the territorial county seat, where official records were kept. What he found there was far darker than forged documents. It was proof that the Fairmonts weren't the Fairmonts at all. The first lie. At the courthouse, Hensworth dug through dusty immigration logs and land deeds. The truth hit him almost immediately. The family who arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 had not been named Fairmont. Their true name was Fleischer. The land deeds from that year showed an Augustus Fleischer purchasing thousands of acres with a mix of gold coins and bank drafts from banks scattered across the East. Not one single source, but multiple banks, multiple accounts. For a frontier settler, that kind of wealth was suspicious. Too suspicious. It suggested either a hidden fortune, or money obtained through questionable means. But money was the least of it. The paper trail didn't stop in Utah. The trail of the Fleischers. Hensworth traced the Fleischers backward along their westward journey, and that's when the pattern emerged. In Missouri, in the city of Independence, a merchant who refused to sell his store to Augustus Fleischer was found dead in his bed. The coroner called it a heart attack, but neighbors swore the man had been in perfect health the week before. His widow, drowning in debts, sold the shop to Fleischer for pennies. In Kansas, near Lawrence, a wealthy landowner disputed the Fleischers' claim to prime farmland. Days later, his horse, spooked, and threw him off a bridge. The bridge, investigators later found, had been deliberately weakened. The Fleischers bought the land soon after. Again and again, the story repeated. The Fleischers would move into a town. They dressed well, acted polite, gained trust. But anyone who opposed them, merchants, farmers, even church leaders, would suddenly face misfortunes. Crops failed, children fell mysteriously ill, investments collapsed overnight, and the outcome was always the same. The Fleischers grew stronger, their rivals grew weaker, or were buried. This wasn't chance. This was strategy. Calculated misfortune. The deeper Hensworth looked, the clearer the pattern became. Every tragedy seemed too perfect, striking at exactly the right moment. A man preparing to testify against them died in a barn fire the week before the trial. A woman spreading rumors about their past miscarried after, accidentally, drinking tainted water. Families who held land they wanted suddenly found themselves broke after a series of failed harvests, while the Fleischers' fields somehow flourished. Each incident was selective, precise, almost surgical, and every single one left the Fleischers standing taller while their rivals vanished. Back further still, the Fleischers weren't the beginning. In older Pennsylvania court records from the 1820s and 1830s, Hensworth found references to yet another name, Faulkner. The family had operated under that name in a small industrial town in Pennsylvania. The Faulkners owned mills, warehouses, and shipping contracts. And once again, the pattern appeared. Their own businesses always succeeded. But their partners, their competitors, their neighbors, one by one, they collapsed, sometimes financially, sometimes literally into graves. It was like watching the same play, just with different costumes. The sheriff's memory. Hensworth's most chilling discovery came not from papers, but from a man. In Philadelphia, he tracked down Thomas Brennan, a retired sheriff who had lived in that Pennsylvania town when the Faulkners ruled it. Brennan, now in his 70s, still remembered them clearly. They had left an impression he'd never been able to shake. They weren't just rich, Brennan told Hensworth over drinks in a dim Philadelphia tavern. Plenty of families were rich. But the Faulkners, they were different. They studied people, always watching, always calculating, like they were measuring everyone, figuring out how to use them. The sheriff leaned in, lowering his voice. They ran that family like a military unit. Everyone had a role. The men handled business deals. The women worked society, spread influence. And the children, they were trained to spy, to listen, to report back. I once caught one of the Faulkner boys sneaking around the courthouse, listening at doors. He couldn't have been older than 12. What Brennan described was not a family in the normal sense. It was an operation, a campaign of control. The cold precision. Brennan explained how the Faulkners never acted recklessly. Their moves were careful, precise. They didn't just fight rivals, they dismantled them. If you crossed them, he said, your life started to unravel piece by piece. Maybe your best worker got sick. Maybe your supplier pulled out of your contract. Maybe your wife suddenly fell ill. You couldn't prove a thing. But by the end, you'd either crawl to them for help, or you'd be ruined. Brennan admitted he had long suspected the Faulkners were behind several unsolved deaths in his town. But without evidence, he had been powerless. By the time whispers grew loud enough, the family had vanished, moving west. And they never looked back. The chilling truth. By the time Hensworth pieced all this together, a terrifying picture had formed. The Fairmonts of Cedar Valley, Utah, the noble, charming, wealthy family admired by their community, were not Fairmonts at all. They were Fleischers. Before that, Faulkners. And behind every name change was a trail of ruined lives, mysterious deaths, and perfectly timed tragedies. It wasn't bad luck that followed them. It was design, and worst of all, this wasn't one man's cruelty. It was inherited, passed down, taught from parent to child. 3 generations had already carried it westward. Now a 4th generation was growing up in Cedar Valley, watching, listening, learning. Jacob realized he wasn't just investigating a forged inheritance claim. He had stumbled into something far bigger. A bloodline bred for manipulation. A family raised to destroy anyone who stood in their way. Pushpin to audience. And that's where part 2 of the Fairmont secret ends. A family that changes its name but not its methods. A trail of accidents, stretching from Pennsylvania to Utah. And a stranger who now knows far too much. But Jacob Hensworth had only scratched the surface. In part 3, he would return to Cedar Valley, and come face to face with the Fairmont children. What he saw in their eyes would confirm his worst fears. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Checkmark. That's part 2, about 1,000 words, restructured for YouTube narration with suspense and simple language. Part 3, revised and expanded, approximately 1,000 words. The strangest thing, Brennan continued, was how the Faulkners spoke of the world around them. They did not view neighbors, rivals, or even friends as fellow human beings. I once heard old William Faulkner refer to the rest of us as breeding stock, the sheriff recalled. His son laughed, but it wasn't a joke. That was how they saw us, creatures existing only for their benefit. The casual cruelty of that remark had stayed with Brennan for decades. It explained the air of superiority that seemed to radiate from the family in every interaction. They did not simply want wealth or respect, they wanted control. And they had perfected the art of achieving it without ever crossing a legal threshold. The pattern of suspicious deaths, convenient accidents, and ruined reputations continued throughout their time in Pennsylvania. A rival merchant might suddenly make a disastrous investment just before a market collapse, one the Faulkners had quietly anticipated. A political opponent would be fed information that seemed credible, only to later be exposed as false, leaving his career in tatters. A romantic rival would find himself lured into compromising circumstances that destroyed his social standing. They had this talent, Brennan explained, for making people destroy themselves. They didn't need to strike directly. They'd set the stage, apply just enough pressure, then stand back and watch. Their victims thought they were acting on their own choices, but in truth, the Faulkners had written the script. The sheriff's most chilling memory concerned the way the family treated their own children. He had observed the younger generation being raised with the same cold efficiency applied to business and politics. Affection was seen as weakness, empathy as a flaw that needed correction. I saw William Faulkner force his 8-year-old son to watch while they butchered a horse with a broken leg, Brennan recounted grimly. The boy begged them to try and heal it, sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. His father made him stand there until he stopped crying. Then he handed him the knife and told him to help with the cutting. Said the boy needed to learn that sentimentality was a luxury they could never afford. That night, Brennan confessed, he had gone home sick to his stomach. The scene had convinced him that the family's power was not an accident of greed or ambition, but the deliberate product of generational conditioning. They were not merely wealthy opportunists, they were raising heirs trained to perpetuate a system of manipulation and dominance. By 1843, the Faulkners had abruptly left Pennsylvania, selling off their assets in record time, so quickly, in fact, that Brennan suspected they had been prepared for flight long before any public accusation surfaced. Their exit coincided with the beginning of a grand jury investigation into fraudulent contracts and the suspicious collapse of several businesses tied to them. Within weeks, they had vanished, leaving no forwarding address. Brennan always suspected they had simply shed their old name and begun again somewhere new. Hensworth's research confirmed that suspicion. What had once been the Faulkners of Pennsylvania had re-emerged as the Fleischers in Missouri and Kansas, and later as the Fairmonts of Utah. Each transition had been carefully managed, complete with forged genealogies, fabricated property histories, and well-timed injections of sudden wealth. It was not reinvention born of necessity, it was strategy, a perfected system for erasing the past and installing themselves as pillars of new communities. The picture that emerged from his investigation was chilling, a family that had cultivated manipulation, exploitation, and cruelty as inherited traits. They were not merely survivors of circumstance, they were engineers of destiny, passing down a philosophy that rewarded deceit, coercion, and emotional hardness. This was not bloodline corruption in any biological sense, but something far more dangerous, a family culture that glorified the worst aspects of human nature as if they were virtues. If the Fairmonts were indeed the Fleischers, and before that the Faulkners, then Cedar Valley was not simply a frontier settlement. It was the crown jewel in a decades-long campaign of psychological warfare. Armed with this knowledge, Hensworth returned to Cedar Valley under a pretense. Publicly, he claimed to have discovered additional records that supported the Fairmonts' inheritance claims. Privately, his true purpose was to gather evidence that could link the family's current identity with its shadowed past. The deeper he looked, the more disturbing the community became. What had seemed, on his first visit, like a thriving agricultural town now revealed itself as a stage-managed society. Prosperity existed, but only under the shadow of one family's dominance. The Fairmonts held sway over land rights, markets, and even marriages through an intricate web of debts, favors, and veiled threats. To piece together the hidden history of the valley, Hensworth began reviewing the records of families who had left the settlement during the previous 3 decades. On paper, most departures were attributed to opportunity, families moving westward, or to larger towns, in pursuit of better prospects. But when he followed the paper trails, a darker pattern emerged. The Morrisons, prominent merchants in Cedar Valley, had abruptly left in 1865 after the death of their eldest son. Officially, James Morrison had died in a hunting accident. Yet those who knew him insisted he had been investigating irregularities in grain shipments tied to the Fairmonts. He had scheduled a meeting with territorial officials to present his findings. He died just days before. His family, grief-stricken and financially exposed, sold their holdings at a fraction of their worth and fled the valley. In 1872, the Caldwell family, who had run the blacksmith shop, departed under disgraceful circumstances. Robert Caldwell, once respected as a steady and rational man, had suddenly begun accusing his neighbors of poisoning his livestock and conspiring against him. His wild claims destroyed his reputation, and his family was forced to abandon their trade. Within weeks, Theodore Fairmont had purchased the shop for a suspiciously low price. Perhaps most haunting was the fate of the Hartwells. Their farmland was among the valley's richest, and Samuel Hartwell was one of the few who openly resisted the Fairmonts. In 1873, he blocked their attempt to expand grazing rights. 6 months later, calamity struck. Their prize bull died of an unexplained illness, their well was poisoned by industrial runoff, and their daughter suffered a crippling fall from her horse. Each incident alone could have been explained as chance, but taken together they spelled ruin. By 1874, the Hartwells had sold their land to cover medical expenses and left Cedar Valley broken. A grim consistency emerged. Every family that suffered tragedy or scandal had one thing in common: they had stood in the Fairmonts' way. Yet the darkest revelation came when Hensworth investigated families who had not merely left, but disappeared. The Pembertons, who owned a small general store, were said to have moved to California in 1869. But in state records, Hensworth could find no trace of their arrival. Their neighbors admitted, under careful questioning, that the Pembertons had not held a farewell gathering or even mentioned their departure. One day they were there, the next they were gone. Even their household belongings remained behind, abandoned in haste. The evidence pointed to a truth Hensworth had not wanted to accept: some families had not left Cedar Valley at all. They had been erased. Part 4. The deeper Hensworth pressed into Cedar Valley's shadowed history, the more he realized he was venturing into a labyrinth from which few returned unchanged. What had begun as a historical inquiry into a family's origin had become something far more dangerous: an unraveling of a decades-long conspiracy of control, intimidation, and calculated destruction. By the winter of 1876, Hensworth had assembled enough evidence to recognize a clear pattern. Families who resisted the Fairmonts' influence either left Cedar Valley under circumstances of tragedy, or they vanished without explanation. Those who remained had adapted to survive. Merchants extended credit to the Fairmonts without hesitation, farmers sold grazing rights at suspiciously low prices, and council members voted in accordance with Fairmont interests even when it ran contrary to their own prosperity. It was as though the entire valley existed within a system of invisible chains, bound by fear more powerful than law or custom. What unsettled Hensworth most was the subtlety of the control. Rarely were threats explicit. Instead, he encountered a web of whispered reminders, sudden misfortunes, and psychological pressures that crushed resistance before it had the chance to take root. One widow described to him, in hushed tones, how her husband had abandoned a land dispute after their young son suffered a fall from an attic window. He never said it aloud, she explained, but we both knew the accident wasn't an accident. After that, we stopped fighting. We sold the land, and we never spoke of it again. The widow's eyes had been haunted, as though even in confession she feared unseen ears. Hensworth's determination to uncover the truth hardened when he began to examine the current generation of Fairmont heirs. Augustus had grown old, his authority passing into the hands of his sons Theodore and Lionel, men who seemed to embody the cold calculation that Sheriff Brennan had once described of the Faulkners. Theodore, the elder, managed the family's business ventures with a ruthless efficiency that left no competitor intact. Lionel, however, was of a different breed, less visible in commerce, but with an uncanny influence over the valley's social sphere. He organized community gatherings, church functions, and charitable endeavors, presenting himself as a benevolent figure. Yet beneath the charm, Hensworth discerned the same precision in manipulation, the same ability to steer conversations, shape opinions, and isolate dissenters. It was in Lionel's dealings that Hensworth detected something particularly insidious. Unlike his forebears, who had relied on intimidation and economic leverage, Lionel had elevated the family's methods into something resembling psychological engineering. He cultivated loyalty not only through fear, but through carefully crafted dependency. Families who fell under his influence found themselves entwined in webs of gratitude and obligation, debts of kindness that could never truly be repaid. A loan forgiven, a harvest saved, a child's education sponsored, acts of generosity that ensured silence when the Fairmonts required it. This new refinement alarmed Hensworth more than the older methods of violence and sabotage. It meant that the family had evolved yet again, adapting their strategies to the times, becoming more difficult to expose. Where once their enemies had died suddenly or vanished mysteriously, now they lived, broken, compromised, their wills bent until they served the very family they had once opposed. One night, while reviewing his notes in the rented room of a sympathetic farmer, Hensworth was startled by a knock at his window. Outside stood a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who introduced himself as Nathaniel Briggs, a former schoolteacher. Speaking in hurried whispers, Briggs revealed that he had once taught several of the Fairmont children and had seen firsthand the methods by which they were raised. "They're trained," Briggs said, his voice trembling, "trained like soldiers, or worse, like predators. Every lesson, every game, every story told to them had a purpose. They learned arithmetic by managing ledgers of imaginary debts, history through tales of conquest and betrayal, language through exercises in persuasion. I tried to teach them kindness, fairness. Their parents corrected me, told me I was wasting their potential." Briggs claimed that he had left his post after a disturbing incident with young Lionel. At just 12 years old, the boy had orchestrated a classroom dispute among his peers, pitting students against each other with whispered rumors. When the conflict erupted into a physical fight, Lionel stood back and observed calmly, as though taking notes. Later, he confessed to Briggs with chilling detachment that he had done it simply to see which of his classmates could be swayed and which resisted manipulation. "I reported it to Augustus," Briggs whispered, thinking he would be horrified. Instead, he praised the boy. Said he showed promise. Fearing for his safety, Briggs had fled Cedar Valley, but the family's reach was long. Wherever he went, opportunities collapsed, friends abandoned him, and whispers of scandal followed. He lived now as a drifter, half-starved and desperate, but compelled to unburden himself to Hensworth, who listened in grim silence. The teacher's testimony aligned disturbingly with the accounts Brennan had given years earlier in Philadelphia. The cycle continued, generation after generation, with each new branch of the family refining and advancing the system of control. Hensworth realized that what he had uncovered was not merely a history of one family's corruption, but the blueprint of a dynasty, an evolving organism that thrived on secrecy, manipulation, and the steady erosion of resistance. The true horror, he now understood, was not what the Fairmonts had done, but what they were preparing to do. Their dominance of Cedar Valley was no longer enough. Through alliances with merchants in the territorial capital, connections with rail interests, and marriages into respectable families, they were extending their reach beyond the valley. The tactics that had destroyed rivals in Missouri, Kansas, and Pennsylvania were being refined for use on a broader stage. If left unchecked, the Fairmonts would not remain a localized terror. They would become an invisible power across the expanding frontier. It was at this point that Hensworth made a fateful decision. He would not merely collect evidence, he would attempt to expose the family publicly. His plan was reckless, but his conscience allowed no alternative. He began drafting a detailed report that traced the family's lineage from the Faulkners of Pennsylvania to the Fleischers of Missouri and finally to the Fairmonts of Utah. He included witness testimony, land records, court documents, and the accounts of families destroyed by their schemes. But even as he compiled his report, he noticed subtle changes in his surroundings. Strangers seemed to watch him in town, their gazes lingering too long. His lodging was searched, though nothing was stolen. At night he heard footsteps outside his window, followed by silence when he looked out. The net was closing, and he knew it. The climax came one bitter February evening. Returning from an interview with an elderly widow, Hensworth discovered that his room had been ransacked. Pages of his manuscript were scattered across the floor, and his inkpot overturned. Yet nothing had been taken, except his confidence. The intruders had left the evidence in place as a message: "We know what you are doing. We allow it only because we choose to." For the first time since beginning his investigation, Hensworth felt true fear. Not merely for his safety, but for his mind. The Fairmonts' genius lay not in brute force but in erosion, breaking men slowly, piece by piece, until they doubted themselves. Already he questioned whether his witnesses were reliable, whether his conclusions were sound, whether he himself was falling into the paranoia that had claimed Robert Caldwell years before. The danger was not simply that the Fairmonts could kill him. The danger was that they could make him destroy himself. Hensworth resolved to leave Cedar Valley temporarily, to secure his notes in a safe location beyond the family's influence. Yet as he prepared his departure, a chilling realization struck him: the Fairmonts had anticipated his every move so far. His flight might already be part of their design. He hesitated at the threshold of his rented room, listening to the silence of the valley night. Somewhere in the darkness, he imagined unseen eyes watching, calculating, waiting. The hunter had become the prey. Part 5. When the thaw of early spring began to soften the snow-choked roads of Cedar Valley, Hensworth prepared for his escape. His notes, hundreds of pages detailing the Fairmont Dynasty's methods of subjugation, were bound in oilcloth, hidden beneath a false panel in his traveling chest. He told no one of his plans. Not the widow who had granted him lodging, not the farmers who had risked whispers of testimony, not even Nathaniel Briggs, whose trembling confessions had given him his most damning evidence. To confide in anyone, he reasoned, was to invite betrayal, whether willing or coerced. Yet the valley itself seemed determined to hold him. A wheel broke on his hired wagon. A horse he had purchased was found lame the next morning. The blacksmith who promised repairs delayed them by days without explanation. At first Hensworth ascribed these misfortunes to coincidence, but the pattern was undeniable. He recalled Sheriff Brennan's words from Philadelphia: "They don't always stop you with bullets. Sometimes they simply make sure you never leave." On the eve of his departure, as twilight spilled its violet haze across the valley, Hensworth was approached by Reverend Cole, the aging pastor of the town's modest chapel. Cole, a man whose sermons had always been cautious, had never spoken ill of the Fairmonts publicly. But now, under the weight of dusk, he confessed something extraordinary. "You believe you can expose them," Cole whispered, his hands trembling as though in prayer. "But you cannot, not because they are invincible, but because they are inevitable." Hensworth frowned. Inevitable. Yes. You see, they are not merely a family, nor a legacy of corruption. They are a system. They adapt as the world adapts. Where Augustus used the whip, Lionel uses charm. Where violence once sufficed, commerce now binds. They do not simply survive opposition, they incorporate it. Your very investigation, Mr. Hensworth, will one day serve their ends, not yours. The Reverend's eyes glistened with despair. He seemed to know he had said too much, yet he pressed on. I tell you this not to dissuade you, but to warn you. The Fairmonts are students of human weakness. They will find yours, as they have found mine. And when they do, you will not even realize the moment you've been bent to their design. The words chilled Hensworth more than threats ever could. 2 nights later, under a moonless sky, he left Cedar Valley. His wagon creaked slowly along the mountain road, the hidden manuscript secured beneath his belongings. Every bend in the trail felt watched, every gust of wind a whisper of pursuit. When he finally descended the pass and entered the wider plains beyond, he allowed himself to breathe, believing for the first time that he had escaped. But the Fairmonts had not needed to stop him. They only needed to follow. In the weeks that followed, Hensworth lodged at inns along the route to Salt Lake City, intending to send his manuscript eastward to trusted colleagues. Yet each time he approached a courier, hesitation overtook him. Doubt slithered into his mind. Were his sources credible? Had he exaggerated their testimonies in the fervor of discovery? Was he chasing ghosts conjured by coincidence and paranoia? The manuscript, once his beacon of truth, now weighed on him like a burden of shame. At a tavern in Ogden, he overheard two merchants discussing the Fairmont name, not with fear, but with respect. One praised their investments in rail construction, another their charitable endowments for schools. These men spoke of Lionel Fairmont as a rising statesman, a figure of promise who might one day shape territorial politics. Hensworth, shaken, realized that outside Cedar Valley the family was not seen as tyrants but as benefactors. His carefully assembled narrative might be dismissed as slander, or worse, as the jealous rant of an academic outsider. The realization gnawed at him. Perhaps Reverend Cole had been right. The Fairmonts were inevitable because they understood perception. Within the valley, they ruled by fear. Beyond it, by admiration. It was in Salt Lake City that Hensworth received his first direct warning. Returning to his rented room, he found the oilcloth bundle of notes undisturbed beneath the false panel. But atop the chest lay a single sheet of paper, folded once. In a flowing, elegant hand, it read, Mr. Hensworth, we commend your diligence, but surely you see now that your story is larger than you. History bends not to truth, but to power. If you wish to endure, lay down your pen. If you persist, you will discover that the shadows you hunt have already claimed you. The initial could only belong to Lionel. From that moment, Hensworth felt the tightening of invisible threads. A publisher who had promised to meet him fell ill without warning. A hotel clerk mistakenly claimed no record of his reservation. A letter he sent to a colleague in Boston was returned unopened, the seal broken, the contents missing. He was not arrested, not threatened in alleys, not beaten by thugs, nothing so crude. Instead, the subtle erosion continued. His network of support dissolved. His confidence withered. His own handwriting began to appear untrustworthy to him, shaky, desperate. It dawned on him, with sickening clarity, the Fairmonts did not need to kill him. They needed only to unmake him. By midsummer of 1877, Hensworth's notes remained unpublished, his resolve broken. He lingered in boarding houses, drinking heavily, scribbling revisions that contradicted one another. To some acquaintances he claimed the family were monsters, to others, he dismissed his own investigation as hysteria. His reputation waned, his credibility frayed. The brilliant researcher had become a figure of pity. One evening, in a haze of exhaustion, he imagined a figure seated at the corner of his room. Lionel Fairmont, youthful, composed, smiling faintly. You see, the apparition whispered, you have done our work for us. Your obsession discredits itself. Soon, you will speak our name and no one will listen. Whether it was vision or madness, Hensworth could not say. But from then on, he ceased to write. The manuscript survived, but only as fragments, scattered drafts, half-burned pages, contradictory accounts. Decades later, antiquarians discovered portions among estate sales and university archives. Some dismissed them as the ravings of a paranoid historian. Others saw glimpses of something far more sinister, a pattern repeating across regions and generations. The Fairmonts themselves prospered. Theodore expanded their commercial empire, Lionel ascended into politics, and their descendants threaded themselves into the fabric of Western development. Railroads, banks, legislatures, each bore their subtle imprint. Always respectable, always admired, yet always feared by those who looked too closely. In the final letter known to survive, written to an unnamed colleague in Philadelphia, Hensworth confessed, I set out to uncover a family. Instead, I uncovered a principle, that corruption, once refined, ceases to appear as corruption at all. It becomes indistinguishable from progress, from order, from destiny. The Fairmonts are not villains in the eyes of history. They are history, and I, who wished to reveal them, have become their greatest proof. No further records of Edward Hensworth exist. Some claimed he returned east and died obscurely. Others whispered he never left Utah, that he simply disappeared one night, leaving behind an empty room and a half-finished glass of brandy. Whether consumed by madness, silenced by power, or absorbed into the very machinery he sought to dismantle, one truth remained unshaken: the dynasty endured, untouched, inevitable. And so the story closed not with revelation, but with absorption, another thread woven seamlessly into the tapestry the Fairmonts had been crafting for generations. Word count. Approximately 1008. Do you want me to continue part 6 as Hensworth disappears and the narrative shifts to the 20th century Fairmont heirs, showing how their influence modernizes into finance, media, and politics? Part 6. The Fairmont Dynasty did not fade with the 19th century. Instead, like a vine that thrives regardless of the soil it is planted in, they adapted. As the frontier gave way to cities, as horses yielded to railroads and railroads to automobiles, the Fairmonts shifted seamlessly from local lords of Cedar Valley to architects of modern America. By 1905, the family no longer resembled the rough-hewn land barons who had once cowed farmers with threats and whips. They had refashioned themselves as financiers, industrialists, and philanthropists. Their mines had been sold to conglomerates, their cattle ranches broken into parcels for development. But their control had not lessened, it had only grown more sophisticated. They now owned banks, rail shares, and sprawling real estate across Utah, Nevada, and California. What had begun as a valley kingdom became an invisible empire stretching across the West. Yet beneath this new veneer of respectability, their methods had not changed. They still governed through silence, influence, and the manipulation of perception. The dynasty had learned from Edward Hensworth's failed exposé. They understood that truth was not to be denied outright, it was to be drowned beneath a tide of competing narratives. The Western Trust. At the center of this new era was Theodore Fairmont, grandson of Augustus, who founded the Western Trust Company in Salt Lake City. Ostensibly a regional bank, the trust rapidly expanded to become a nexus for land speculation, mining ventures, and rail investments. Ordinary settlers saw in the trust a respectable institution that funded schools, churches, and irrigation projects. But behind its polished facade, Western Trust was a machine of entrapment. Loans were extended with deceptively favorable terms, then called in suddenly, forcing families to surrender property. Competing businesses were quietly bought out through webs of shell companies. Politicians indebted to the trust found themselves voting for ordinances that favored Fairmont holdings. By 1912, it was whispered that no mayor in the territory could be elected without Western Trust's blessing. And yet, there was never proof. Documents vanished. Witnesses recanted. Newspapers ran flattering profiles rather than exposés. It was as though the dynasty had absorbed Hensworth's lessons and perfected them, truth buried not by fear, but by admiration and confusion. Lionel's legacy. Lionel Fairmont, meanwhile, had pursued politics. By 1916 he held a seat in the U.S. Senate, where he spoke eloquently of progress, industry, and the promise of the West. He presented himself as a reformer, a builder of opportunity. His speeches called for federal investment in railways, for programs to bring education and prosperity to remote towns. Few knew that the companies contracted for such projects were Fairmont-controlled. Behind closed doors, Lionel proved as cunning as any of his ancestors. Correspondence from the era, unearthed decades later in private collections, revealed his method: never oppose reform directly, but guide it. When labor unions rose in the mining districts, Lionel publicly praised their cause, then quietly ensured their leaders accepted compromises that left Fairmont interests untouched. When prohibition swept the nation, he positioned himself as a moral advocate, even as his associates controlled lucrative smuggling networks in Nevada and California. To the public, Lionel was a statesman. To those who peered too closely, he was the smiling mask of a dynasty that had learned to rule not through tyranny, but through the appearance of benevolence. The unquiet generation. The 1920s brought wealth to America, and with it, further transformation of the dynasty. The Fairmont heirs of that era were no longer frontier aristocrats but cosmopolitan figures, educated at Harvard and Yale, photographed in evening wear beside motorcars and jazz orchestras. Society pages praised their marriages to East Coast families, cementing the dynasty's legitimacy beyond the West. Yet even this modernized image carried shadows. Rumors circulated of sudden bankruptcies among those who competed with Fairmont businesses. Editors who prepared unflattering articles found their newspapers purchased overnight. Lawyers who pressed cases against the dynasty reported anonymous threats, or sudden, irresistible promotions that pulled them far from the courtroom. It was during this decade that the whispers of a Fairmont network began to take shape. To some, it was merely a conspiracy theory, that a single family could not possibly control so many threads of commerce, politics, and culture. To others, it was self-evident, an invisible hand steering the course of the West. The war years. The Second World War cemented the dynasty's place in the national fabric. Fairmont-owned companies supplied steel, machinery, and even uniforms to the U.S. military. Their hotels housed officers, their banks managed war bonds. Theodore's son, Richard Fairmont, served briefly in the Navy but spent most of the war coordinating procurement contracts, a role that brought staggering profit. It was also during this period that the family began to court Washington directly. Their charitable foundations, ostensibly for education and veterans relief, funneled influence through carefully placed donations. Senators spoke glowingly of the Fairmont commitment to democracy. Presidents sent letters of thanks for their contributions. But as before, their benevolence masked something darker. Small contractors who resisted Fairmont consolidation found themselves blacklisted from military contracts. A whistleblower in Los Angeles claimed the family was siphoning war materials for private use, only to vanish days later, his car abandoned by the roadside. The case was never solved. By 1946, the dynasty had become untouchable. To criticize them was to invite ridicule or ruin. They had become not merely powerful, but respectable, an institution indistinguishable from the progress of the nation itself. The vanishing of Hensworth's legacy. During these years, a curious artifact resurfaced. In 1948, a young archivist at a Boston library discovered fragments of Edward Hensworth's manuscript, misfiled among unrelated collections. The archivist, intrigued by the strange references to the Fairmont dynasty, began preparing an article for publication. Within months, the archivist resigned suddenly and moved overseas. His article never appeared. The fragments vanished from the collection, leaving only a vague notation in the archive's register, removed by request. No one could say whose request that was. The 1950s. A new mask. By mid-century, the Fairmonts were no longer merely a family. They had become a dynasty embedded in corporations, foundations, and universities. Their heirs were less visible as individuals and more as a network of trustees, directors, and donors. The dynasty's public identity shifted once again, from frontier barons to industrialists, from industrialists to patrons of art and science. Fairmont money built museums, endowed universities, and funded medical research. Public opinion adored them. The dynasty had achieved what Edward Hensworth had once feared most: corruption refined so thoroughly that it no longer appeared as corruption at all. It appeared as progress. And yet, in the shadows, the old methods endured. Whispers of blackmail, of ruined careers, of vanished critics, trailed behind their philanthropy like smoke behind a polished carriage. The dynasty no longer needed to silence every opponent, they needed only to ensure that such opponents appeared untrustworthy, unstable, or insignificant. Thus the Fairmonts stepped into the modern age not as villains, but as visionaries. Their empire had become invisible, their power indistinguishable from destiny itself. But every dynasty carries within it the seeds of its own unraveling. And as the 20th century deepened, cracks began to show, not in their wealth, but in their bloodline. The heirs of the mid-century were not Augustus's iron-fisted descendants, nor Lionel's eloquent statesmen. They were children of privilege, bred in luxury, prone to scandal. And though the Fairmont machinery could bury most whispers, some escaped. It would be these heirs, their weaknesses, their excesses, that threatened to undo what centuries of cunning had built. Word count. Approximately 1006. Do you want Part 7 to continue by focusing on the mid to late 20th century Fairmont heirs, with scandals, affairs, drugs, secret societies, and how the dynasty works to keep their grip while facing the first cracks in their inevitability? Part 7. By the mid-20th century, the Fairmont dynasty stood at the height of its power. Their name adorned hospital wings, university halls, and orchestral stages. Politicians praised them as patrons of the common good, business journals celebrated their visionary capitalism, and society magazines paraded their heirs across glossy pages. But beneath the curated glow of respectability, something darker stirred. For centuries, the dynasty had thrived by cultivating discipline, Augustus with his fists, Lionel with his rhetoric, Richard with his industrial schemes. Yet the heirs of the post-war generation grew up in a world their ancestors had already conquered. Power, to them, was not something to be fought for. It was a birthright, and birthrights can corrode those who inherit them too easily. The age of excess. The 1960s introduced a new strain of Fairmont, heirs raised in boarding schools and Ivy League dormitories, surrounded not by cattle herds or iron foundries but by champagne, art collections, and jet travel. They were children of affluence, not empire. Among them, Julian Fairmont, grandson of Richard, became emblematic of this new age. Educated at Princeton, he drifted through Europe in tailored suits, leaving behind a wake of rumors, extravagant parties in Paris, clandestine gambling in Monte Carlo, an affair with a minor royal. Newspapers treated him as a glamorous figure, but insiders whispered of darker habits, narcotics, debts quietly erased by the dynasty, and companions who disappeared as swiftly as they arrived. Julian was not alone. His cousins in Los Angeles dabbled in the growing film industry, funding studios while appearing in tabloids alongside starlets. One heir was rumored to have financed a cult-like commune in the Mojave Desert, only for the commune to dissolve after a series of unexplained deaths. Police reports existed briefly, then vanished into sealed archives. It was excess without consequence, scandal without repercussion. The dynasty's machinery remained powerful enough to scrub clean almost any blemish. But cracks were beginning to show. The velvet leash. The Fairmont strategy of the era was simple: contain scandal, redirect attention, and purchase silence. Lawyers operated as shadow priests, drafting settlements that bound victims and critics alike. Journalists received anonymous tips leading them to juicier, safer targets. One particularly striking case emerged in 1969. A reporter from a Denver paper investigated Julian Fairmont's ties to a series of art thefts in Italy. Before his exposé could be published, the reporter accepted a position at a New York magazine, with a salary quadruple his former pay. The story evaporated. Years later, he admitted privately that the offer had come with one condition: never again write about the dynasty. This pattern repeated endlessly. Fairmont heirs could stumble into scandal after scandal, yet none seemed to touch them. Friends of the dynasty called it luck. Enemies knew it as the velvet leash, an invisible restraint that ensured no accusation ever ran its full course. Blood in the water. But by the late 1970s, the dynasty could no longer suppress every story. The era itself was shifting. Investigative journalism was ascendant, distrust of the elite widespread. Watergate had taught America that even the untouchable could fall. The first public crack came with Adrian Fairmont, a charismatic heir who dabbled in politics. Groomed as the family's next Lionel, Adrian ran for a congressional seat in Nevada. His campaign was sleek, funded by dynasty coffers, his rhetoric polished. Yet midway through the race, rumors surfaced of his ties to organized crime, specifically, Las Vegas casinos notorious for laundering mob money. The Fairmont machinery scrambled to contain the damage, but for the first time, not all outlets complied. A small but fearless weekly published bank records tying Adrian's shell companies to casino accounts. Though mainstream papers buried the story, whispers spread fast enough to derail his candidacy. Adrian withdrew, citing health reasons, but the dynasty was shaken. For the first time in living memory, a Fairmont had been wounded publicly. The dynasty could contain the story but not erase the scar. The cult of control. It was around this period that another rumor began to circulate, that the Fairmonts had established a private inner circle, less a family council than a quasi-religious order devoted to maintaining control at any cost. Some called it the Circle of 12. Others dismissed it as invention. The supposed evidence came from disparate sources: minutes from a shuttered foundation, a diary of a Fairmont secretary, an anonymous letter sent to the San Francisco Chronicle. All described gatherings at remote estates, where only a select few family members were initiated into the circle. Rituals were whispered, candles, oaths, cryptic references to Augustus and Lionel as the first and the voice. Whether fact or fabrication, the rumors spread because they felt true. After all, how else could one explain the dynasty's uncanny ability to endure scandal, to redirect scrutiny, to emerge unscathed decade after decade? If the circle did exist, it was less about mysticism than coordination, a network. Ensuring loyalty, secrecy, and control across generations. Scandals of the 80s. The 1980s proved especially dangerous. The dynasty had diversified into media holdings, buying up local television stations and newspapers. But the rise of independent outlets, fueled by cable and talk radio, meant fewer levers of control. Julian Fairmont, older now, was arrested in Switzerland on charges of smuggling antiquities. Though acquitted on a technicality, photographs of him leaving court in disgrace made international headlines. The dynasty's image of refinement was tarnished. Meanwhile, Adrian reappeared in the news after a mistress alleged he had fathered her child and abandoned them. Though the case was quietly settled, tabloid journalists sensed blood. Stories of the cursed dynasty began appearing, pieces speculating on drugs, hidden affairs, even whispers of ritualistic gatherings. The dynasty weathered it, as always, but the tone had shifted. Once portrayed as untouchable, they were now seen as decadent. What Augustus had forged through fear and Lionel through persuasion was being eroded by the vanity of his descendants. Cracks in the foundation. By the close of the decade, financial shifts also began to threaten their empire. The dynasty had invested heavily in real estate during the boom, but the late 1980s collapse left several ventures bleeding. Though they remained wealthy beyond measure, the illusion of infallibility dimmed. Behind closed doors, family meetings grew acrimonious. Some heirs called for austerity, a return to disciplined investments. Others resisted, unwilling to surrender their luxuries. Old money was colliding with new appetites. More troubling still, a new generation, the children of Julian, Adrian, and their cousins, was coming of age. Raised amid privilege, they displayed little of the cunning that had preserved the dynasty for centuries. Drugs, reckless marriages, celebrity entanglements, the tabloids gorged on their excesses. For the first time since Augustus carved his dominion in Cedar Valley, the Fairmont name carried not just our fear, but ridicule. The shadow of Hensworth. Amid all this, fragments of Edward Hensworth's lost manuscript re-emerged yet again. In 1987, a retired professor claimed to have copies of pages hidden in his personal collection. He described them as the key to understanding the dynasty's true methods. Within months, he died suddenly of a heart attack. His home was cleared by unknown parties before family could recover his papers. The coincidence was never investigated. But to those who knew the whispers, it was confirmation. The dynasty still watched, still silenced, even as their heirs blundered. The legacy in question. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Fairmont Dynasty remained vast, wealthy, and influential, but no longer unassailable. They were seen as powerful, yes, but also fragile. A family bound by shadows, sustained by machinery of influence, yet corroded from within by indulgence and scandal. The old power remained, but it was changing. No longer invisible destiny, it had become contested myth. And in that tension, between their unyielding machinery and their unraveling bloodline, lay the seeds of what would come next. For dynasties do not collapse in a single night. They erode slowly, the rot hidden beneath marble until the facade itself begins to crack. The Fairmont Dynasty had survived frontier brutality, industrial transformation, and global war. But would it survive its own children? Word count. Approximately 1009. Do you want Part 8 to focus on the 1990s and early 2000s digital age, where secrecy is harder to maintain, the dynasty faces leaks, hacking, and whistleblowers but also adapts by embedding themselves into technology? And media. Part 8. The 20th century ended with the Fairmont Dynasty still intact but undeniably weakened. They had survived every storm of the past 300 years, wars, scandals, depressions, even whispers of occult rituals. But the new century brought a challenge their ancestors could not have anticipated: the collapse of secrecy itself. In the age of satellites, surveillance, and the internet, shadows were harder to control. The velvet leash of lawyers and settlements, so effective in the 20th century, was beginning to fray. Information had become liquid, uncontrollable, a torrent that could sweep away reputations overnight. For the Fairmonts, masters of control, this was nothing less than existential. The dawn of exposure. The 1990s opened with a string of embarrassing leaks. In 1992, an anonymous source uploaded internal memos from Fairmont Real Estate Holdings onto an early bulletin board system. The memos revealed tax avoidance schemes and offshore accounts routed through the Cayman Islands. Although only a handful of hackers and enthusiasts ever saw the files, the dynasty understood the threat. If a few students with dial-up connections could pierce their armor, how long before true adversaries followed? They responded by investing not only in new businesses but in information control. Fairmont subsidiaries began quietly purchasing stakes in telecommunications firms, cable providers, and, most presciently, emerging internet companies. Their strategy was clear: if the next century's battles would be fought over data, they intended to own the battlefield. But even as they invested, their heirs continued to stumble. Heirs without discipline. The 1990s heirs were children of excess raised in a world of instant communication. Unlike Augustus, Lionel, or Richard, they had never known hunger, war, or even meaningful denial. Their vices, cocaine, fast cars, doomed celebrity marriages, were not merely whispered in smoky parlors but broadcast on cable television and tabloid covers. Cassandra Fairmont, Julian's daughter, became a staple of gossip columns after a string of affairs with musicians and actors. One particularly infamous incident in 1996 involved a midnight car crash in Los Angeles. Though charges of intoxication were dropped, photographs of her staggering barefoot on a highway circulated widely. Adrian's son, Marcus, fared no better. Obsessed with technology, he founded a series of startups, most of which collapsed under accusations of fraud and mismanagement. Yet each time, venture capital mysteriously appeared to fund his next venture. Critics muttered that dynasty coffers were being drained to indulge him, while others suspected the investments were deliberate experiments, testing how influence might be woven into the very code of the internet. The media war. By the early 2000s, the dynasty faced its greatest public test yet: the age of digital journalism and the blogosphere. Independent reporters, no longer bound by editors or publishers, could now publish globally at the click of a button. In 2002, a website calling itself Dynasty Watch published a sprawling exposé on the Fairmont empire. It claimed access to fragments of Edward Hensworth's lost manuscript, weaving them with leaked tax records and interviews with estranged staff. The articles described the dynasty as a hidden parliament of power, cloaked in philanthropy but fed by shadow. The site exploded in popularity. For the first time, ordinary people outside the family's immediate sphere could consume the whispers that had long circulated only in elite circles. The dynasty retaliated. Lawsuits were filed. Hosting providers were pressured. Advertisers were threatened. Within months, Dynasty Watch vanished. Its founder, an investigative journalist named Rachel Montrose, disappeared into obscurity, rumored to have accepted a lucrative ghostwriting contract under an alias. The dynasty had won the battle. But the war was shifting. Every time they silenced one voice, three more appeared. The hacker threat, 2007 marked another turning point. A hacker collective calling itself the Mirror breached servers belonging to Fairmont Energy Holdings. Thousands of documents spilled into the digital ether, confidential emails, photographs, financial ledgers. Among the revelations was evidence of environmental violations covered up with bribes, and even more damning, internal correspondence about containment measures for whistleblowers. The documents sparked protests in 3 states and nearly triggered a congressional inquiry. The dynasty moved swiftly. Within weeks, the Mirror's leaders were arrested on charges ranging from identity theft to terrorism. Yet the arrests only amplified the myth. Some members claimed in interviews that their own defense attorneys were compromised, that they had been offered deals in exchange for silence. The message was unmistakable. The Fairmonts could still reach anyone, anywhere. But the spectacle of hackers versus dynasty had altered perception forever. To younger generations, the family was no longer just an old money curiosity but a symbol of hidden power resisting exposure. The whisper of the circle. The Circle of 12, the rumored inner cabal, returned to headlines in 2010 when a cache of leaked emails contained cryptic references to the meeting at Stonegate and renewing the oath. Though skeptics dismissed the phrases as business metaphors, conspiracy forums seized upon them as proof of ritualistic continuity. Blogs and YouTube channels filled with grainy images of Fairmont estates, aerial photographs of private gatherings, and amateur analyses of financial filings. Some speculated that the dynasty was less a family than a long-standing cult of control, its wealth merely the mask of deeper, stranger rituals. The dynasty issued no comment. Silence only fanned the flames. Adaptation in the digital age. Despite the scandals, the Fairmonts adapted. They poured billions into Silicon Valley, becoming early investors in major social media platforms. Insiders whispered that their influence extended not only to boardrooms but to algorithms, that the dynasty had learned how to shape digital attention just as Lionel once shaped oratory and Richard shaped steel. In 2015, an investigative journalist noted that stories critical of the Fairmonts often failed to trend online, vanishing from feeds within hours. Whether coincidence or algorithmic bias, the pattern was too consistent to ignore. A new form of the velvet leash had emerged, softer, subtler, woven not through settlements and silences but through the code of the platforms themselves. The new heirs. As the 2020s dawned, a new generation of heirs emerged. Unlike their reckless parents, these young Fairmonts were raised in a world where every misstep could become permanent digital record. They cultivated carefully manicured online personas, philanthropy, climate activism, startup culture. To the public, they seemed reformist, polished, socially conscious, eager to break from the sins of their fathers. But to those who studied the dynasty closely, the resemblance to Augustus and Lionel was unmistakable, discipline masquerading as benevolence, strategy clothed in charm. If the rumors of the circle held any truth, then perhaps these heirs were not naive reformers but initiates, trained to adapt the dynasty's ancient machinery to a world of hashtags and live streams. Legacy in flux. By the end of the second decade of the 21st century, the Fairmont dynasty had transformed once again. They were no longer cattle barons, industrialists, or jet-setting playboys. They had become something more elusive, curators of perception, guardians of attention in a digital world. And yet, the old shadows never vanished. Leaked fragments of Hensworth's manuscript still surfaced from time to time. Whispers of rituals at Stonegate persisted. Dissidents claimed that beneath the gleaming facade of philanthropy and social media activism, the dynasty remained what it had always been, a machine built to control, silence, and endure. The question was no longer whether the Fairmonts could survive scandal, they had proven that countless times. The question was whether, in a world of total surveillance and permanent record, the dynasty could maintain its most precious possession, invisibility. For without invisibility, power becomes just another spectacle. And a spectacle, no matter how dazzling, can always be consumed. Word count. Approximately 1004. Would you like Part 9 to explore the present decade 2020s 2030s, where AI, deepfakes, and surveillance reshape both the dynasty's methods and the public's resistance, blurring the line between myth and reality even further? Part 9. By the third decade of the 21st century, the Fairmont Dynasty stood at a crossroads. For centuries, their greatest asset had been control, of land, of industry, of narrative. But now they faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before, a world in which control itself was dissolving. Every scandal, every secret, every slip of the tongue could be recorded, copied, and broadcast in seconds. The old velvet leash, lawsuits, settlements, payoffs, was blunt against a foe that multiplied in the ether. Information was no longer scarce, it was infinite, viral, and alive. For most dynasties, this would have meant extinction. For the Fairmonts, it meant adaptation. The era of infinite mirrors. The 2020s were the decade of mirrors. Deepfakes blurred truth and illusion. AI-generated voices could conjure speeches that were never spoken. Anonymous accounts could create waves of outrage or admiration overnight. The Fairmonts moved swiftly to harness this chaos. Insiders whispered that the dynasty funded entire laboratories dedicated to synthetic reality, teams of coders, artists, and data scientists crafting armies of digital ghosts. These phantoms populated comment threads, manipulated hashtags, and seeded narratives across multiple platforms. The method was ingenious. Instead of silencing critics, they drowned them in noise. Every real accusation was met with a dozen counter-narratives, some plausible, some absurd, all muddying the waters. A leaked document from 2022 described this as flooding the stage, not controlling truth, but overwhelming it until audiences no longer cared to distinguish. If the 20th century Fairmonts had ruled with velvet gloves and sealed envelopes, the 21st century heirs ruled with illusions layered like smoke. The architects of perception. Two heirs rose to prominence in this age. Celine Fairmont and Damien Fairmont, cousins groomed from birth not as landowners or industrialists but as digital strategists. Celine, a graduate of MIT's Media Lab, was rumored to run a shadow operation known internally as Project Eurifaisa. Her specialty was algorithmic influence, studying how search results, recommendation engines, and trending tags could be nudged to tilt entire populations toward desired narratives. Publicly, she appeared as a philanthropist supporting digital literacy initiatives. Privately, she was whispered to be the dynasty's most dangerous tactician since Lionel. Damien, on the other hand, was an aesthete. A charismatic figure with a background in film and theater, he became the dynasty's face in the influencer era. His Instagram accounts were curated masterpieces, private jets, philanthropic galas, environmental summits. Yet leaked emails suggested many of these moments were staged sets, entire charities conjured for the sake of optics, dismantled once the cameras departed. Together, Celine and Damien represented a duality, the unseen hand that shaped perception, and the visible face that performed it. The digital resistance. But just as in every previous century, resistance stirred. The very technologies the dynasty wielded also empowered their critics. Independent journalists used blockchain-based platforms to publish exposés beyond censorship. Hacker collectives distributed caches of documents through decentralized networks, immune to takedowns. AI tools that could forge illusions also helped truth seekers authenticate originals. In 2025, an anonymous group calling itself the Lanterns released the Fairmont Files, a 600-gigabyte archive allegedly drawn from the dynasty's private servers. The documents contained contracts with governments, memos about surveillance projects, even references to ritual gatherings at the ancestral Stonegate estate. The dynasty's response was chilling. Within weeks, most links to the files vanished. Journalists covering the leak found their social accounts banned, their articles deranked, their platforms mysteriously demonetized. Some claimed the dynasty's influence extended into the very moderation systems of major platforms. The Lanterns were never caught, but the files themselves were buried beneath layers of counter-narratives. Forums debated endlessly: authentic or hoax? Genuine evidence or another Fairmont illusion, designed to discredit dissent by flooding the stage with forgeries? No one could say for certain. And that uncertainty was victory enough. The persistence of ritual. Amid all this digital warfare, the strangest rumor persisted, that the Circle of 12 still met. Drone footage captured by activists in 2027 appeared to show black cars arriving at Stonegate under the cover of a moonless night. Heat mapping technology revealed gatherings in subterranean chambers. Leaked fragments from an internal chat log mentioned renewal of oaths and passing of keys. Some dismissed it as symbolic corporate jargon, others as confirmation of centuries-old ritual continuity. The dynasty offered no denial. In the silence, myth thrived. A dynasty of data. By the late 2020s, Fairmont influence had shifted almost entirely into the invisible realm of data. Their holdings in agriculture, steel, and energy had been quietly sold or merged. In their place, they had become curators of digital infrastructure, undersea cables, cloud computing networks, satellite constellations. The dynasty was no longer simply wealthy, they were custodians of the channels through which modern life flowed. One could avoid their hotels, ignore their brands, or boycott their products. But to communicate, to work, to live online, you inevitably crossed their wires. It was said that Augustus had built railroads to move cattle, Lionel had built machines to move armies, and Richard had built skyscrapers to house bankers. Celine and Damien, it seemed, were building something greater, a cathedral of information itself. The age of invisibility. What made the dynasty truly terrifying in this era was their subtlety. Unlike the billionaires who flaunted yachts and space rockets, the Fairmont heirs cultivated restraint. They appeared only enough to be admired, then retreated. Their foundations sponsored climate summits, their names adorned hospital wings, their faces appeared in glossy magazines, but never too often. The rest was shadow. Decisions made in boardrooms without minutes. Acquisitions cloaked through shell companies. Influence woven not through headlines but through what headlines never appeared. As one dissident analyst put it in 2028, greater than, the Fairmonts no longer care if you believe in them. They care only that you see through a glass darkly. Their power thrives not in certainty but in doubt. They are most secure when you are unsure whether they exist at all. Looking toward 2030, as the decade closes, questions abound. Will the dynasty's heirs maintain their grip on perception in an age where AI can generate infinite realities? Will resistance movements find ways to cut through the fog? Or will the Fairmont name dissolve entirely into the fabric of digital infrastructure, surviving not as a family but as a system, faceless, nameless, eternal? Perhaps Edward Hensworth foresaw this in his lost manuscript, when he described the dynasty as a shadow that lengthens, even when the candle burns low. 3 centuries on, the Fairmont candle still burns. The shadow, impossibly, continues to grow. And as we stumble into the next decade of chaos and illusion, one truth becomes undeniable: the dynasty has become the age itself. Part 10: The Dynasty Beyond Flesh. By the mid-21st century, humanity itself had entered an age once thought impossible. Cities hummed with autonomous machines, thought could be uploaded into silicon, and algorithms knew desires before they were spoken aloud. Nations bent beneath the weight of digital empires, their sovereignty eroded by corporations that commanded not land, but consciousness. And still, in the shadows of this strange new world, the Fairmont dynasty endured. No longer were they mere land barons, industrialists, or even digital illusionists. They had become something greater, something uncanny, an inheritance that had transcended flesh. The last of the flesh and blood Fairmonts. The 2030s had seen Celine and Damien rise to the apex of invisible power. Yet by the dawn of the 2040s, both heirs had begun to withdraw from public life. Their appearances grew infrequent, their foundations more opaque, their voices rarer. When Damien made what would be his last known public speech in 2041, analysts remarked that he seemed almost unreal. His movements fluid, his voice perfect, yet his eyes glassy, as if he were both there and elsewhere. A whistleblower would later claim that Damien had undergone continuity procedures, a hybrid of neuromapping, AI simulation, and biological preservation. Celine, ever the tactician, was said to have pioneered this transformation. Her project, code-named Eidolon, sought to free the dynasty from the vulnerabilities of mortality itself. Rumor held that entire minds, Fairmont memories, Fairmont instincts, Fairmont ambitions, were being digitized, trained, and deployed as entities within vast neural networks. It was whispered that the Circle of 12 had been reborn, not in stone chambers beneath Stonegate, but in endless servers housed in black monolith data centers across 3 continents. A dynasty of echoes. By 2045, even insiders admitted it was impossible to know which Fairmonts still lived in flesh and which existed only as digital echoes. Public statements issued by the dynasty bore no signatures, only the Fairmont crest, the Ouroboros wrapped around a torch. Fairmont voices appeared in VR conferences and holographic summits, but their origins were opaque. Were these the preserved minds of Celine and Damien? Were they AI constructs trained on centuries of diaries and letters? Or were they simply masks, projected by unknown actors behind the curtain? The truth hardly mattered. What mattered was that the voices carried weight. Decisions made by the dynasty reshaped trade, steered investment, influenced entire populations. The Fairmonts had become less a family and more a continuum, a dynasty unmoored from blood, surviving instead as pattern and memory. The dominion of silence. The Fairmont strategy of the 2040s was unlike any before it. In centuries past, they had manipulated narratives, flooded the stage with illusions, and cultivated myths of secrecy. But in this new age of infinite realities, they chose something more terrifying: silence. While rivals boasted of breakthroughs in biotech or space colonization, the Fairmonts said nothing. No interviews, no declarations, no explanations. This silence became power. For in a world where every company and leader competed for attention, the absence of the Fairmonts made them spectral, an invisible force whose presence was felt but never confirmed. A proverb circulated among digital dissidents. Greater than, when you hear nothing, that is when the Fairmonts speak loudest. The ritual transformed, and still, the old rituals endured. But no longer cloaked in midnight robes or candlelit halls. Instead, initiation into the Circle of 12 now occurred within immersive digital temples, vast Gothic cathedrals rendered in hyper-real virtuality. Candidates were said to wander labyrinths of shifting code, confront simulations of their own fears, and swear oaths before avatars of past Fairmonts, their spectral voices echoing from servers buried beneath oceans. What had once been superstition and symbolism had become something darker, the binding of human loyalty to digital phantoms that could never die. Resistance in the machine. Not all bowed to this spectral dynasty. The lanterns, though diminished, survived into the 2040s, evolving their own tools of resistance. Instead of publishing leaks, they built counter-ICE trained to detect Fairmont illusions and unmask fabricated narratives. But even resistance seemed futile. For every revelation, the dynasty adapted. For every exposure, they built new masks. The more their critics fought, the more they seemed to prove the dynasty's omnipresence. By 2048, a haunting belief had taken root in activist circles. Greater than, you cannot fight the Fairmonts, because to fight them is to become part of their story. And once you are in their story, you never leave. The ghosts of tomorrow. As the 2050s dawn, humanity stands on the edge of its own transformation. Minds upload into machines. Nations fracture under digital feudalism. The line between living and simulated blurs into fog. And through it all, the Fairmonts endure, no longer as a dynasty of blood, but as ghosts of tomorrow. Entities too fluid to kill, too elusive to trace, too ancient to forget. Perhaps Edward Hensworth, in his lost manuscript, foresaw this when he wrote, "Greater than, the dynasty is not men, nor women, nor heirs. It is a contagion of will, carried from body to body, machine to machine, like breath on glass." 300 years since their first steps into power, the Fairmonts remain, unseen, unbounded, yet undeniably present. And so the question lingers, whispered in the alleys of resistance, muttered in forums soon erased, carried in dreams that feel too heavy to dismiss. What happens when the dynasty no longer needs us at all? Final reflection. The story of the Fairmonts is not merely the tale of a family, but the mirror of our own age. It is about power's hunger to survive, to adapt, to shed skin after skin until it becomes eternal. Whether you see them as myth, metaphor, or terrifying reality, one truth remains. Every dynasty leaves ruins. Some leave monuments. But the greatest dynasties leave questions that never die. The Fairmonts are that question. And we, unwillingly, unknowingly, are the answer. Fire your turn. You've now traveled across centuries of shadows with me, from the dynasty's whispered birth to its spectral survival beyond flesh. Right finger, do you believe dynasties like this could truly exist, weaving through history unseen? Right finger, what do you think? Myth, metaphor, or reality hiding in plain sight? Right finger, could the Fairmonts already be among us, faceless, timeless, invisible? If this journey stirred you, then don't let it end here. Subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives into hidden histories. Share this with someone who loves mystery, power, and the dark corners of history. And most importantly, leave a comment below with your thoughts, your theories, your questions. Because maybe, just maybe, the Fairmonts are watching the comments too.